It begins in the quiet, not the absence of sound, but the deep weighted silence of a place where time itself seems to have settled like fine dust on every surface. Here, in the low, focused light of an archivist's desk, the air is still, cool, and dry. It carries the faint earthen scent of baked clay and ancient paper. This is a space outside the noise of the present, a vault where the dead still speak, though only in whispers etched into stone and clay. The world outside continues its frantic pace, but in this room, the only movement is the slow turning of a page or the careful adjustment of a lamp. It is in such stillness that certain questions begin to surface. Not loud, insistent questions, but quiet, persistent ones that rise from the artifacts themselves. They are not questions of our own making. They are echoes from a past so remote it feels like a different reality altogether. Before us rests a single object, unassuming yet holding the weight of a forgotten world. It is a prism of pale clay, no larger than a human hand, covered in the dense, precise script of cuneiform. The hands of a researcher, gloved and deliberate, turn it slowly under the beam of light, revealing columns of text that flow with an unnerving regularity. This is the prism of Weld Blundell, one of the most complete copies of what is known as the Sumerian King List. It is a document from the earth of ancient Mesopotamia, a ledger of rulers and reigns meticulously copied by a scribe some 4,000 years ago. It is not a story in our sense of the word. It is an administrative record, a cold chronological account of power. And its first lines do not begin where our history books do. They begin somewhere else, somewhere before. It starts with a simple, unsettling statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This single phrase quietly dismantles our foundational narrative of human progress. The list does not speak of a slow, arduous climb from primitive tribes to organized societies. It does not describe the invention of governance as a human solution to the problem of chaos. Instead, it presents kingship as a complete, pre-existing system, an institution that was not created on earth, but delivered to it. The language is not that of myth or metaphor. It is the detached procedural language of a transfer. The concept of kingship, the entire apparatus of civilization, law, and order, arrived fully formed. It descended. It was placed in the first city, Eridu, as if a piece of technology were being installed. The list immediately establishes a world where the most fundamental aspect of civilization was not an achievement to be earned, but an inheritance to be managed. We must consider the hand that pressed these wedges into the wet clay. This was the work of a scribe, an ancient accountant of reality. Their task was not to inspire or to create epic tales of heroism. Their function was administrative, their mindset that of a bureaucrat. They were cataloging what was known, preserving a sequence of events held to be fact. The tone of the King List is devoid of embellishment or poetic flourish. It is repetitive, structured, and profoundly orderly. This dispassionate precision is perhaps the most disturbing quality of the document. The scribe records reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, with the same methodical calm as they record a reign of a few decades. For them, these were not figures of myth. They were entries in a ledger, data points in a long, unbroken continuity of power that stretched back into a past we can no longer properly imagine. The numbers themselves are a silent challenge to our understanding of time. The first king listed, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 800 years. His successor, Alalangar, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 kings in 5 different cities, their reigns totaling 200 years. These are not symbolic numbers or scribal errors. They appear consistently across multiple fragments of the list found in different locations and copied at different times. They are presented as historical data, part of the same continuous record that eventually lists well-known historical figures like Gilgamesh. The scribe makes no distinction. The document simply presents a chronology that operates on two completely different scales of existence, one impossibly vast and the other recognizably human, and insists that they are part of the same single history of kingship on earth. This record creates a profound contradiction. Our own story of civilization is one of gradual emergence, a slow dawn spreading over millennia. We picture early humans gathering in small agricultural communities, slowly developing tools, laws, and social structures through trial and error. The Uruk period, around the 4th millennium BCE, is seen as the crucible where these elements first coalesced into true urban life. Yet this tablet, written by the inheritors of that very culture, describes a fully functional system of governance already in place long before the first mud bricks were laid at Uruk. It suggests that what we call the dawn of civilization may have been something else entirely. The moment humans were first tasked with managing a pre-existing, and perhaps already ancient, terrestrial operation. The list does not describe the beginning of a system, but a change in its management. One can almost feel the physical presence of the object itself, its density and its coolness in the climate-controlled air of the archive. The dust that a brush clears from its grooves is the soil of southern Iraq, the sediment of the Tigris and Euphrates. This small piece of baked clay has survived the collapse of empires, the shifting of languages, and the erosion of memory itself. It is a stubborn fact, an artifact that persists in telling a story that we have no framework to accommodate. It forces a question that is rarely asked. What if the Sumerians were not using mythology to explain their present, but were instead trying to accurately record a past whose nature was fundamentally different from their own? What if they were the inheritors of a world whose rules had been established long before their own history began? The structure of the document reinforces this sense of a divided past. The list is not a seamless flow of impossibly long reigns. It is punctuated by a single catastrophic event. After the reign of the 8th king, Ubara-Tutu, the text states with stark simplicity, "Then the flood swept over." This is the great deluge, the world-ending cataclysm that appears in so many ancient traditions. And for the scribe, it is a clear line of demarcation. Following this entry, the narrative resets. The text continues. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The system is reinstalled, but something has changed. The reigns of the post-Diluvian kings, while still long by our standards, are drastically shorter. They are measured in hundreds of years, not tens of thousands. The scribe has recorded a clean break, a fundamental shift in the very fabric of time and power. The overwhelming sensation one gets from reading the king list is not one of discovery, but of succession. It is not a story of creation, but one of stewardship. The first human rulers in the period we recognize as history are not depicted as innovators or pioneers. They are shown receiving a mandate that already existed, stepping into roles that were already defined. They inherited the machinery of civilization, the laws, the agricultural science, the urban blueprints, the concept of a divinely ordained order. The text implies that their primary role was not to build a world from scratch, but to maintain one that was already ancient and deeply complex. They were the first managers, the first caretakers of a silent, abandoned kingdom, tasked with continuing a project whose origins were already lost to them. The lamp is switched off. The prism is left to rest in the consuming darkness of the vault. The initial question, born from the cold, administrative language of an ancient scribe, now fills the silence. It is not a question that demands an immediate answer, nor is it a question for everyone. It is a question for those who are comfortable in the shadows of history, for those who sense that the story we tell ourselves is incomplete. It is for those who are not afraid of the deep time that precedes our own, and who suspect that some truths are not found in grand revelations, but in the meticulous, unsettling details of a 4,000-year-old ledger. Those who have remained here, in this quiet contemplation, already understand the nature of the vigil we are about to keep. The inquiry has already begun. The journey deeper into this silence begins not with a story, but with a ledger. We return to the clay prism, to the Sumerian king list, and allow our eyes to trace the lines of script not as narrative, but as data entry. The scribe's hand was steady. Alulim in Eridu is assigned a reign of 800 years. Alalangar, his successor, 36 years. The numbers are recorded with the same dispassionate precision as the name of the city or the sequence of the ruler. There is no attempt to explain or justify these figures. They are presented as fact, an entry in a cosmic balance sheet. The scribe does not differentiate between a reign lasting 8 sars, a Sumerian unit of 600 years, and one lasting a mere 2 decades. It is all part of the same continuous, unbroken record of an office, the office of kingship. The sheer scale of the numbers is met with a profound administrative calm, a quiet insistence that this is simply how things were. We can see the hands of a modern researcher turning a replica of the prism under a low-angled light. The clay has a warmth to it, a connection to the sun and soil of its origin. Every wedge-shaped mark is a deliberate act, a physical impression of a thought, a memory, a piece of data. The researcher is not deciphering a poem. They are auditing an ancient account. The tools are modern: magnifying glasses, digital calipers, high-resolution cameras, but the act is timeless, one human mind trying to understand the records left by another. Yet the gulf between them is not merely one of centuries, but of worldview. The modern mind searches for metaphor, for symbolic meaning, for a rational explanation for the impossible numbers. The ancient record offers none. It simply presents its data, waiting in the silence of the archive for a framework that can contain it. This is not an isolated anomaly. Other documents, scattered across the collections of the world, echo this same strange administrative reality. We turn our attention to the Temple Hymn of Kesh, a text praising the city of Nippur and its patron, Enlil. The text describes the founding of the city not as a human endeavor, but as a divine construction project. It reads like an architect's charter. The foundations were laid. The bricks were molded to a specific standard. The shrines were allocated to specific deities with designated functions. Enlil is not a god of abstract concepts like justice or wisdom. Here, he is the chairman of the board, the ultimate authority in a hierarchy of governors. His city, Nippur, is described as the bond of heaven and earth, a central administrative hub from which the directives of the entire system flowed. The language is one of order, of structure, of a world built according to a pre-existing and meticulously detailed blueprint. The implications of this language are profound. The relationship described is not one of faith, but of function. Humans are not portrayed as worshippers seeking favor, but as citizens, or perhaps employees, living within a system established and managed by these powerful entities. A tablet from the archives of Ur lists the divine residence of its main temple, not as a pantheon, but as a household staff. Each is given a title and a specific role. Nana, the city's patron, is the master of the house. His consort, Ningal, is the mistress. Their gatekeeper, their vizier, their various attendants are all named. This is the organizational chart of a cosmic manner, a structure of governance that is mirrored perfectly in the terrestrial administration of the city-state. The sacred was not separate from the profane. It was the framework upon which the entire profane, practical world was built. A long, slow pan across a drawer of catalogued tablets. Hundreds of them, biscuit-colored and silent, each one a fragment of this immense bureaucratic machine. They are labeled with small, neat tags: ration list, land sale, legal verdict, omen text. The air in the room is still, the only sound the faint hum of a climate control system. This is the background noise of preservation, the sound of a culture holding its breath for 4 millennia. The sheer volume of these administrative records is overwhelming. More than 90% of all cuneiform texts ever recovered are not myths or epics, but these mundane documents, receipts, contracts, inventories. It is the paperwork of a civilization, and it is within this vast, dry archive of the ordinary that the truly extraordinary is hidden, recorded with the same unblinking attention to detail. We are now looking at a fragment of the Atrahasis, an Akkadian epic that preserves a much older Sumerian account of creation. But when we read it through the lens of the scribe, it is not a story of divine mystery. It is a record of a labor dispute and its resolution. The text begins by describing a world where the junior Anunnaki are tasked with the hard physical labor of maintaining the world, digging the canals, dredging the rivers, building the infrastructure. After thousands of years, they rebel. The text records their complaint. The work is too hard, the misery too great. They burn their tools and march on the compound of their superior, Enlil. It is a strike. The situation is presented as a crisis in management, a logistical problem that threatens the stability of the entire operation. The response is not a display of divine wrath, but a council meeting. The senior Anunnaki convene to find a solution. The text reads like the minutes of that meeting. Enlil demands the execution of the ringleader, but another entity, the wise Enki, proposes a different path: technological innovation. He suggests the creation of a substitute worker, a primitive laborer, to take over the toil of the junior gods. The text describes the process with a strange, almost clinical precision. The goddess Nintu, a specialist in this field, is called upon to mix the clay with the flesh and blood of a sacrificed god. The goal is explicitly stated: to create a being capable of bearing the workload so that the cosmic system can continue to function smoothly. Humanity is not born of divine love or a grand creative impulse. It is engineered as a workforce solution. Observe the tone. There is no poetry here, no sense of wonder at the creation of a new form of life. The language is procedural. 14 birth goddesses are assembled, 7 on the left and 7 on the right. The clay is prepared. The incantations spoken are less like prayers and more like activation codes. The result is the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker. The text concludes that this new being has been successfully tasked with the corvée of the gods. The problem is solved. The scribe records this not as a foundational myth for the human condition, but as the successful implementation of a new labor policy. The entire event is framed by its utility. Humanity's purpose, from the very beginning, was to serve the operational needs of a pre-existing, non-human order. Perhaps it is a good moment to simply be still, to notice the quality of the light in the room where you are, the exact time on the clock, the subtle sounds of the world outside this narrative. This small act of observation, of recording a moment in your own space and time, is a distant echo of the scribe's work. It is an acknowledgement that we too live within systems, surrounded by quiet data points that we rarely stop to register. If you feel so moved, make a small note of this moment, a private entry in a ledger of your own. It is a way of participating in this vigil, of sharing the silence that connects our world to theirs. The transfer of knowledge and civilization is detailed in other texts with similar dispassion. The concept of the me is central to this. These are not abstract divine blessings. They are described as a set of fundamental principles or technologies that underpin a functioning society. A tablet from Nippur lists them like a software inventory. There are over 100 of them, covering everything from kingship, priesthood, and law, to crafts like leatherworking, masonry, and basket weaving, and even social concepts like falsehood, strife, and the plundering of cities. They are tangible objects, cosmic blueprints that could be held, transported, and installed in a city. One story recounts how the goddess Inanna travels to Enki's city of Eridu, and through cunning acquires these me to bring them back to her own city of Uruk, instantly elevating its status. This story is often read as a myth about the rivalry between cities. But if we read it as the scribe wrote it becomes a report on the transfer of proprietary technology. Inanna does not simply learn the arts of civilization. She takes possession of the core operating system. The me are loaded onto her boat of heaven, like cargo. The text lists them as they are brought aboard. The act is one of acquisition, not inspiration. This suggests that civilization was not something to be developed over centuries of trial and error, but a package of protocols that, once installed, made a city functional. The source of this technology was always the same: the domain of the Anunnaki. They were the developers and patent holders of the very concept of organized life. Let us descend further into the mundane, for it is here that the scale of this system becomes undeniable. We are in a museum storeroom, faced with drawers containing thousands of small, pillow-shaped tablets. These are the ration lists from the great temple factories of the late 3rd millennium BCE. Each one is a marvel of detailed accounting. They record the daily, monthly, and yearly allotments of barley, oil, and cloth for thousands of workers, categorized by profession, gender, and age. The scribe notes the names of the supervisors, the specific tasks performed, the exact quantities dispensed. The sheer mathematical complexity is staggering. This was not a primitive barter economy. It was a centrally planned and managed command economy of a scale that would not be seen again for thousands of years. The hands of an archaeologist carefully place one of these tablets on a velvet cushion. Its surface is dense with tiny, precise marks. It is a record for a single work crew for a single month. So many bushels of barley for the male laborers, a lesser amount for the female laborers, a smaller amount still for the children. Nothing is left to chance. This is the evidence of a vast, stratified, and highly disciplined society. But the question that rises from the dust of this tablet is not about economics. It is about origins. Where did this system come from? It appears in the archaeological record almost fully formed, with a level of administrative complexity that seems to have no primitive precursor. It is as if the software of bureaucracy was installed and running from day one. A moment of pure sensory focus. The silence of the archive is broken only by the soft click of a camera shutter. A researcher is documenting a cylinder seal, a small stone carved with a miniature scene. When rolled across wet clay, it leaves an impression, a signature of ownership or authority. The scenes depicted are not of everyday life. They show human figures, priests or early rulers, being led into the presence of seated, larger-than-life figures, often with horned helmets indicating their divine status. The human is always smaller, always deferential. They are being brought before a superior. These are not images of worship. They are images of audience, of reporting to a higher authority. They are the visual record of the chain of command. We return, once more, to the king list. We look past the impossible numbers and notice another strange detail: the mobility of the institution of kingship. The text is structured as a sequence of transfers. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then, after the long reigns of its first 2 kings, the entry simply states, "Then Eridu was smitten, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira." There is no mention of war, conquest, or rebellion. The language is that of a calm, orderly relocation of a central office. The kingship itself is treated as a singular, mobile entity, an object of power that is allocated to a specific city for a specific period of time before being moved elsewhere. This pattern repeats 5 times before the flood, passing through Larak, Sipar, and Shurupak. This phrasing contradicts our entire model of ancient history, which is based on the rise and fall of competing city-states. The king list does not describe a world of independent political entities vying for dominance. It describes a world of designated regional capitals within a single unified system of governance. The decision of where the kingship should reside seems to be made by an outside authority. The cities themselves are passive recipients of this power. It is as if a corporate headquarters were being moved from one branch office to another by a decision from a remote board of directors. The scribe is not recording the messy, chaotic process of human history. They are documenting the placid, administrative reassignments of a terrestrial franchise. Finally, we examine a boundary stone, a kuduru, from a later period, but one that preserves the ancient legal framework. The stone records a land grant, meticulously detailing the dimensions of the field, the names of the surveyors, and the list of witnesses. But the ultimate authority validating the transaction is not the human king. The king is merely the one who executes the grant. The top of the stone is carved with the symbols of the great Anunnaki, Enlil, Anu, Enki. Their presence is the ultimate guarantee of the contract's legitimacy. The text contains curses against anyone who would dare to alter the boundary, and these curses are invoked in the names of these cosmic governors. Even long after they have receded from direct management, their authority remains the bedrock of law and order. The cumulative weight of these records begins to settle. The king list with its impossible chronologies, the creation texts that read like labor reports, the me tablets that list civilization as a transferable technology, the ration lists that reveal a vast, centrally planned economy, the cylinder seals that depict a clear chain of command, the legal stones that invoke a non-human authority. Taken individually, each can be dismissed as myth, as metaphor, as scribal convention. But viewed together, laid out on the archivist's table under the low, quiet light, they cease to be individual stories. They become the interlocking paperwork of a single, vast, and internally consistent system. A system whose logic is not our own, and whose architects are recorded with the cold, irrefutable precision of an accountant's hand. The question is no longer whether these records are strange. The question is why they are so relentlessly, so methodically, so administratively coherent. The work of the archivist is one of quiet comparison. It begins with a single point of data, one tablet, one chronology, but its true purpose is to find the echo, the repetition, the resonance across time and distance. In the low light of the conservation lab, the researchers' hands carefully position fragments side by side. One from the ruins of Larsa, another unearthed a century later at Nippur. They are separated by miles of dust and generations of scribes, yet the script tells the same story. The same kings, the same impossibly long reigns, the same catastrophic flood, the same reinstallation of the system. The consistency is unnerving. It is not the fluid, evolving narrative of a myth passed down orally, changing with each telling. It is the rigid, standardized data of a distributed database, copied with meticulous care to avoid corruption. The scribes were not poets. They were auditors, ensuring the record remained unchanged. This act of comparison is not limited to the contents of a single archive. It extends to the land itself. We see the hands of an archaeologist now, not in white gloves, but covered in the fine, pale dust of southern Iraq. They are tracing the foundation of a wall at Eridu, the city named first in the king list. Ground-penetrating radar scans reveal the outlines of structures built upon even older structures, a layering of history that descends into the earth. The lowest levels, the ones that correspond to the period just before our recorded history begins, show evidence of a master plan. The layout is too orderly, the canal systems too sophisticated for a first attempt. It is as if the builders were not inventing a city, but assembling one from a pre-existing set of instructions. The physical evidence on the ground begins to mirror the textual evidence from the tablets, a system that arrives fully formed. The pattern, once seen, begins to appear everywhere. The dust of Mesopotamia is not the only soil that holds this memory. We move west, across the deserts and seas, to the fertile black land of the Nile. Here, another of humanity's foundational civilizations carved its own history into stone and papyrus. The Turin King List, a document as detailed and administrative as its Sumerian counterpart, begins in the same way. Before the first human pharaoh, Menes, who unified the land, the papyrus lists a long succession of divine and semi-divine rulers. The reigns are impossibly long, stretching back into a remote antiquity the Egyptians called Zep Tepi, the first time. The scribe who compiled this list, like the one in Sumer, made no distinction. The divine rulers and the historical pharaohs are part of the same single, unbroken line of kingship. We stand before the Abydos king list, carved into the cool stone of a temple wall. The cartouches of the great historical pharaohs, Seti I, Rameses II, are presented in a neat, orderly procession. But this list, too, acknowledges a time before them. Other Egyptian chroniclers, like the priest Manetho, speak of these preceding eras in explicit terms. He records dynasties of gods who ruled for thousands of years, followed by a dynasty of beings called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. These were not gods, but they were not yet men as we know them. They are described as a transitional administration, a bridge between the divine governors and the first mortal kings. Once again, history does not begin with a struggle out of chaos, but with an orderly, documented handover of a pre-existing system of power. The function of these Shemsu Hor is particularly telling. They are not remembered for heroic battles or grand myths. They are remembered as the ones who established the framework of the civilization. They were the surveyors who laid out the dimensions of the sacred precincts, the astronomers who codified the knowledge of the stars, the engineers who passed down the secrets of stonework. They were the bearers of the me in an Egyptian context, the agents who installed the operating system of their culture. The evidence for their work is not found in stories, but in the silent mathematical precision of the earliest monuments. A researcher's pen traces the alignment of a pre-dynastic temple, noting its perfect orientation to the winter solstice sunrise. This is not the work of primitive beginners. It is the legacy of a transferred science. The pattern is no longer a coincidence. It is a structural signature. The two most influential civilizations of the ancient world, Sumer and Egypt, though separated by a formidable desert and developing unique languages and cultures, built their entire conception of history upon an identical foundation. Both recorded, with the dispassionate clarity of a state archivist, that their civilization was not their own invention. It was an inheritance. They were the successors to a long-established order, managed for millennia by a non-human ruling class. The story of humanity, in both a cuneiform tablet and a hieroglyphic inscription, begins with a change in management. The sheer improbability of two independent cultures generating the same, highly specific, and deeply strange administrative history by chance is a silence that grows louder the longer one sits with it. There are patterns that only reveal themselves in stillness, over long periods of observation. To recognize them is to participate in the same patient work as the archaeologist and the scribe. It is to look past the noise of individual stories and listen for the deeper, resonant frequency beneath them. Those who have remained in this inquiry understand this. You are not just a passive observer. You are a keeper of this vigil, sharing in the quiet act of connecting threads that have lain severed for millennia. The journey from here requires this shared state of mind, this willingness to see the shape that emerges when the fragments are finally brought together into the same light. The echo of this pattern is not confined to the river valleys of the old world. It crosses the vastness of the ocean. We find ourselves now in a different landscape, one of green, suffocating jungle, and the gray stone of pyramids that tear their way through the canopy. Here, in Mesoamerica, the Maya developed a civilization of stunning complexity. Their history is not recorded on clay, but in the intricate glyphs of the Dresden Codex and the narrative of the Popol Vuh. And when we examine their foundational accounts, the same strange structure appears once more. The Popol Vuh does not begin with the Mayan people. It begins with the creator gods, the framer and the shaper, who exist in a world not yet prepared for humanity. Their story of creation is not a single majestic act. It is a series of attempts, a process of trial and error that reads like a laboratory report. First, they create creatures of mud, but they cannot think or speak and dissolve in the water. It is a failed prototype. Next, they fashion beings from wood. These can speak and multiply, but they have no hearts, no minds, and do not remember their creators. They are a functional but flawed model, and they are wiped out in a destructive flood. The text describes this process with a sense of technical problem-solving. The gods convene. They discuss the design flaws. They iterate. The goal is not to create a creature to be loved, but one that can fulfill a specific function. Finally, after much deliberation, the gods succeed. They fashion the first true humans from maize dough. And what is the purpose of this successful creation? The text is explicit. They are to be the providers, the supporters, but most importantly, they are to be the keepers of the days. Their primary function is to understand and maintain the sacred calendars, the immensely complex cycles of time that govern the cosmos. They are not created to rule the world, but to serve as the caretakers of a vast, pre-existing cosmic clockwork. Like the Sumerian man created to bear the workload of the gods, the Mayan man is created to perform a crucial administrative function within a larger system. Their existence is justified by its utility. The pattern has now acquired a third, and even more unsettling, dimension. It is not just a shared narrative of a handover from divine predecessors. It is a shared memory of humanity being created for a specific, functional purpose within a system that predates them. The Sumerians were the workforce. The Mayans were the timekeepers. In both accounts, humanity is not the pinnacle of creation, but a component, a solution to a logistical problem faced by the engineers of the world. The deep structural similarity in these accounts, separated by an ocean and thousands of years, begins to challenge the very notion of independent cultural development. It suggests the possibility of a common source, a single global memory of humanity's true origins. This shared memory extends beyond the narrative and into the technical. A researcher stands at a survey marker, the desert sun casting a long shadow. They are charting the ziggurat of Ur, noting its corners are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. Thousands of miles away, another team uses satellite data to analyze the layout of Teotihuacan in Mexico. The entire city is laid out on a precise grid, oriented not to the cardinal directions, but to a point 15, 5 degrees east of north, an alignment that tracks the rising point of the Pleiades on a specific ancient date. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid shafts point with unerring accuracy to specific constellations, as they would have appeared in the sky thousands of years ago. This is the deeper pattern. It is a shared global obsession with a specific kind of knowledge, the precise measurement of the earth and the meticulous observation of the heavens. This is not the simple agricultural astronomy of tracking seasons. This is advanced, highly mathematical geodesy and celestial mechanics, a science that appears fully formed at the dawn of these civilizations. The Sumerian sexagesimal system of mathematics, which we still use to measure time in circles, was based on their understanding of cosmic cycles. The Mayan long count calendar could track time with greater accuracy than the calendar we use today. The question is not how they developed these systems, but why they all developed such similar complex systems dedicated to the same purpose, locking their civilizations into alignment with the cosmos. One can almost feel the cool night air on the Giza Plateau. The 3 great pyramids stand as silent mountains of stone against a sea of stars. They are not just tombs. They are machines of time, monuments of measure. Their very placement on the ground is a mirror of the three stars in Orion's belt. They are a terrestrial echo of a celestial pattern. This act of mirroring, of making the earth a reflection of heaven, is a foundational principle that unites these disparate cultures. It is the signature of a shared worldview, a shared directive. It is the work of architects who saw the planet not as a home to be conquered, but as a site to be surveyed, aligned, and integrated into a much larger cosmic order. The silence that hangs over these ruins is not one of emptiness, but of suspended function. These sites feel like abandoned instruments, vast stone observatories built for a purpose we have forgotten. The hands of the researcher brush away sand from a cartouche, revealing a name. They catalog a glyph, noting its calendrical significance. They measure an angle, calculating its astronomical target. Each action is a small attempt to reverse engineer the original intention. But the more data they collect, the more the pattern solidifies. It is a pattern of a single, coherent, global project. A project that involved the establishment of civilizations at specific sites, the transfer of a specific package of advanced knowledge, and the installation of humanity into a specific functional role. The implications are staggering. To accept the pattern is to accept that the history of our planet may be fundamentally different from the one we have written. It suggests that our oldest civilizations may not be the independent origins of humanity's climb, but rather the scattered, regional franchises of a single, ancient, and planetary-scale enterprise. The Sumerian scribe in his dusty office, the Egyptian priest carving his king list into stone, and the Mayan astronomer priest painting his codex, they may not have been recording the histories of their own people. They may have all been recording the local administrative history of the same, receding global management team. The light in the archive seems dimmer now, the air heavier. The fragments of clay and stone laid out on the table are no longer just artifacts from isolated cultures. They have become exhibits in a single, vast, and silent case. The case for a world whose first chapter has been systematically erased, leaving behind only these strange, persistent echoes. The pattern does not provide an answer. It simply presents a contradiction on a global scale. It forces a new question, one that moves beyond the dusty plains of Sumer and encompasses the entire planet. Were we ever truly alone? And if we were not, what was the nature of the project for which our world was the blueprint? To speak of them is to risk falling into the language of myth, a language the scribes themselves so carefully avoided. The records do not introduce them with thunder or with light. They are simply there, in the background of the administrative world, as a pre-existing condition of reality. The texts refer to them collectively as the Anunnaki. It is not a name, but a designation, a class. It translates loosely to those of royal blood, or those who from heaven to earth came. But the most accurate translation, given the context of the documents, might be something closer to a title: the governors, the executive council, the ones in charge. Their presence is not a matter of faith. It is an administrative fact, the highest authority in a cosmic chain of command. They are the silent signatories on every foundational document of the civilization. Their hierarchy is described with the same dispassionate clarity as the dimensions of a grain silo. At the apex is Anu. He is not a creator god in a paternal sense. His role is that of a remote, ultimate authority, like a distant sovereign or a chairman of the board. His seat of power is not on earth but in the heavens, and his decrees are the basis of all order. He is invoked in legal texts not as a figure of comfort, but as the final court of appeal, the ultimate source of the legitimacy that flows downward. He rarely intervenes directly. His function is to exist as the fixed point from which the entire system derives its structure and its right to operate. The scribes record his name with a symbol that also means heaven, a simple equation of authority and location. The silence that surrounds the figure of Anu in the terrestrial records is functional. His distance is what gives the system its stability. He is the anchor, not the engine. This allows us to observe the structure he oversees, a world not of chaos and divine whim, but of delegated responsibilities and clearly defined spheres of influence. The earth is not a playground for warring deities. It is a territory, an asset, divided and managed with logistical precision. The texts describe a world where every river, every city, every natural resource has been assigned to a specific departmental head, each one reporting up the chain of command. The order is not spiritual, it is organizational. It is the framework of a vast interplanetary enterprise. On Earth, the chief executive officer of this enterprise is Enlil. His name is often translated as Lord of the Wind or Lord of the Command. The texts from his city, Nippur, portray him as the enforcer of Anu's decrees, the governor-general of the entire terrestrial operation. He is not a god to be loved. He is an authority to be obeyed. It is Enlil who holds the Tablet of Destinies, a document that sounds mythical, but is described in terms that suggest a master plan or a set of core directives for the planetary project. When the junior Anunnaki go on strike in the Atrahasis, it is to Enlil's gate they march. When the noise of humanity becomes a problem, it is Enlil who authorizes the flood. His actions are not driven by malice, but by a severe, unwavering commitment to the stability and efficiency of the system he manages. His brother, Enki, presents a different function. His domain is Eridu, the first city, and his title is Lord of the Earth, or Lord of the Sweet Waters. The records portray him as the chief scientist, the master engineer, the head of research and development. It is Enki who understands the physical laws of the world, who surveys the land, who plans the canals that make the desert bloom. When the council needs a solution to the labor crisis, it is Enki who proposes and oversees the genetic engineering project that results in the creation of the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker. He is the problem solver, the repository of the technical knowledge, the me, required to make civilization function. He is not a god of wisdom in an abstract sense, but the custodian of the operational blueprints. The dynamic between these two figures, Enlil and Enki, is not one of good versus evil. It is the classic organizational tension between the operations manager and the head of engineering. Enlil is concerned with order, command, and the integrity of the mission. Enki is focused on technology, creation, and finding clever solutions to logistical hurdles. The stories of their conflicts, when read through this administrative lens, become minutes from a series of contentious board meetings. They are disagreements over policy, over the best way to manage the planet and its resources, including the newly created human workforce. The scribes record these disputes with the same factual tone they use for listing barley rations, suggesting it was simply a known aspect of the command structure. There is a strange, cold rationality to their actions that defies our expectations of the divine. When they decide to establish a new city, the texts do not speak of a sacred vision. They speak of measuring the ground, molding the first brick to a specific standard, and laying the foundations according to a plan. When they assign a patron deity to a city, it is framed as the appointment of a local governor, who is then responsible for that city's productivity and its adherence to the central decrees from Nippur. The relationship between these governors and their human subjects is not one of shepherd and flock. It is one of foreman and work crew. A moment of stillness is required to absorb this shift in perspective. The wind that blows across the excavated ruins of Uruk carries not the whispers of gods but the imagined hum of a vast ancient industry. The dust that settles on the researcher's hands is not just the remnant of a lost faith, but the residue of a forgotten project. The entire landscape begins to feel different. It is no longer a cradle of civilization, but an abandoned work site, littered with the monumental evidence of a project whose managers have long since clocked out. The silence is no longer empty. It is filled with the echo of a purpose we can no longer read. The pre-Diluvian kings listed on the prism of Weld Blundell now appear in a new light. They are not mythical figures from a dream time. With reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, they cannot be human. The list presents them as the first terrestrial managers, the appointed overseers for each of the 5 pre-flood administrative centers. Their impossibly long tenures suggest they were not men, but members of the Anunnaki themselves, assigned to govern directly on the ground. Their names, Alulim, Alalangar, Enmen-Luana, are recorded as the first in the long line of succession. They were the original CEOs of the Earth franchise. Their function was explicitly administrative. The texts state that they held the kingship, an institution that was lowered from heaven. They were not inventing governance. They were implementing a pre-packaged system. The cities they ruled, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, are described as the earliest hubs of this operation. Bad Tibira, for instance, is referred to as a center for metallurgy, a fortress of the coppersmiths. These were not just population centers. They were specialized industrial sites, each with a designated function within the larger economic plan overseen by these long-lived governors. The scribe is not recounting a fairy tale. They are listing the early history of the project's regional headquarters. Even the act of creating humanity is stripped of all sacredness. The Atrahasis presents it as a pragmatic, if ethically questionable, corporate decision. The problem was labor. The solution was a biological machine. The goddess Nintu, acting as the chief medical officer or geneticist, is given the task. The text is clear. Let her create a mortal, that he may bear the yoke. The purpose is explicit. The process is technical. The result is a workforce. Humanity is introduced into the system not as its crowning achievement, but as a piece of equipment, designed and deployed to solve a logistical crisis and ensure the continued productivity of the Anunnaki's terrestrial operations. This functional, almost clinical view of the world extends to every aspect of the civilization they designed. The me, those fundamental principles of society, were not divine gifts bestowed out of love. They were the operating system, the package of protocols and technologies required to run a complex society. They included everything from the blueprint for kingship and the legal code to the techniques for irrigation and the craft of brickmaking. A text describes how they were stored in Enki's city of Eridu, much like proprietary software kept at a corporate headquarters. Acquiring them, as the goddess Inanna did for her city of Uruk, was an act of industrial espionage, a transfer of key technologies that could instantly upgrade a city's status and capabilities. One can almost see the scribe's hand pausing above the wet clay, choosing the precise wedge that denotes function over the one that denotes spirit. It is a deliberate choice, repeated over countless tablets. These beings are defined by what they do, not by what they are. They are the ones who survey, who build, who legislate, who manage. They are the architects of the world's first infrastructure, the authors of its first legal codes, the managers of its first organized labor force. They are not gods who demand worship. They are governors who demand quotas. Their presence in the record is the presence of a vast, silent, and overwhelmingly competent bureaucracy. The air in the archive grows heavy with the weight of this implication. If these beings were not gods but governors, then the entire foundation of human history rests not on a spiritual awakening, but on a political and economic reality we have completely misread. The first temples were not houses of worship. They were administrative centers. The first priests were not holy men. They were the local scribal class, the intermediaries who managed the flow of goods and information between the human workforce and their non-human overseers. The first prayers were not expressions of devotion. They were standardized reports, petitions, and formal requests submitted through the proper channels. This rereading of the evidence does not solve the mystery. It deepens it to an almost unbearable degree. It removes the comfortable buffer of mythology and replaces it with a stark, operational history that is in many ways more difficult to comprehend. It suggests that our species was born into a world that was already ancient, already organized, and already owned. We were not the masters of a new creation, but the late-stage employees of a long-running, and perhaps failing, cosmic enterprise. The ruins of Sumer are not the monuments of our birth, but the abandoned offices of our former employers. The question, then, is not what these beings were. The records are clear on their function, if not their nature. The far more unsettling question, the one that rises from the silence between the lines of cuneiform, is a simple one. The scribe records their presence, their actions, their system, with meticulous detail. But a careful reading of the chronology shows a change, a transition, a slow, steady withdrawal. The records document their departure. The true question, the one that defines the beginning of our own history, is not how they ruled. It is why they left. The work of the archaeologist is often a study in layers, a descent through the compressed centuries. But the most unsettling discovery is not an artifact, nor a tomb. It is the discovery of a void, a sterile band of soil, sometimes meters thick, sandwiched between two distinct periods of high civilization. We see the hands of a researcher now, pointing a trowel at one such line in the wall of an excavation trench. Below it, the dense, artifact-rich stratum of the Uruk period, filled with pottery, seals, and the detritus of a complex urban society. Above it, the beginnings of a later settlement. But between them, there is only wind-blown sand and silt. It is a layer of silence, a span of unrecorded time where a city ceased to be a city, where the hum of administration simply stopped. This physical gap in the earth is a perfect mirror of the gaps in the textual record. The scribe's meticulous chronology is not a seamless narrative. It is a chain of events punctuated by clean, unexplained breaks. We return to the king list. After the long reigns in Eridu, the text does not describe a slow decline or a political transition. It simply states, "Then Eridu was smitten, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira." The word smitten is a ghost, a placeholder for an event that is not described. Was it a natural disaster? A military conquest? A deliberate dismantling? The record is silent. It is the language of a report, noting the closure of one office and the opening of another, with the reasons for the closure redacted from the final document. The story of our world is written around these empty spaces. It is in these moments that we meet the true antagonist of this inquiry. It is not a force of chaos or a rival power. It is an absence, a methodical, pervasive silence that seems to fall at the most critical junctures of the record. This antagonist is the eraser of memory, the breaker of continuity. It is the force that turned a living history into a collection of disconnected fragments. It is the reason the scribe's work so often feels like an attempt to reconstruct a story whose beginning and middle have been deliberately removed. We are not just reading a damaged history, we are confronting the evidence of a systematic deletion, a great forgetting that stands between our time and the true origin of the project. The pattern of this forgetting is not random. It seems to follow the slow, deliberate withdrawal of the Anunnaki from the terrestrial stage. In the earliest layers of the tradition, they are physically present. They walk the earth. They chair council meetings. They give direct orders. The texts are records of their actions, their decisions, their management of the planetary enterprise. But as we move forward in time, through the strata of the archives, their presence becomes more remote. They recede into the heavens. They cease to be governors one meets, and become distant deities one must petition through increasingly complex and desperate rituals. The silence grows in direct proportion to their distance. We can trace this process in the changing role of a figure like Enlil. In the foundation texts, he is the hands-on administrator in his headquarters at Nippur, the enforcer of policy. A complaint about the noise of the human workforce is brought directly to his attention, and he makes a swift, executive decision. But by the time of the Babylonian empires, 1,000 years later, he has become a far more abstract concept. His will is no longer delivered by decree, but must be divined from the entrails of a sacrificed animal, from the pattern of oil on water, from the flight of birds. The system of direct communication has broken down, replaced by a technology of guesswork and supplication. The records no longer document a conversation. They document an attempt to be heard across a vast and growing silence. This textual fade is matched by a physical one. The end of the Uruk period, around 3100 BCE, represents one of the great archaeological mysteries. This was a culture that had developed a continental-scale network of trade and settlement, all centrally managed. And then, it collapses. Not in a single fiery event, but in a widespread systemic shutdown. Cities are abandoned. The complex administrative tools, the cylinder seals, the numerical tablets, disappear from the record for a time. The machinery of civilization sputters and goes quiet. Archaeologists digging through these layers are like investigators at the scene of a massive silent power failure, trying to understand why a grid that illuminated a continent suddenly went dark. One can almost feel the wind that now scours these abandoned places. A long, slow shot of the sun setting over the silent mounds that were once the vibrant cities of Sumer. The air cools. The shadows lengthen, swallowing the faint outlines of streets and temples. This is the landscape of the Great Silence. The dust that swirls in the fading light is the dust of forgotten records, of unbaked clay tablets dissolved by the infrequent rains, of a language that is no longer spoken. It is the physical residue of the antagonist, the quiet evidence of a world that was unplugged, its memory left to erode under the patient, indifferent sky. The silence here is not empty. It is a presence, a weight on the land. This is a moment to become aware of the space around you, the specific quality of the quiet in the room where you are now. Is it the hum of an appliance, the distant sound of traffic, or is it something deeper? Take a moment to simply register it. If you feel inclined, make a note of the time and the nature of this silence. This small, personal act of recording an absence is a ritual. It is a way of joining the vigil, of acknowledging the gaps, of feeling the same resonance that the archaeologist feels when they place their hand on a sterile layer of earth. You are marking a space between the noise, participating in the same search for what is no longer there. We are left with fragments. The vast majority of the cuneiform tablets that have survived are broken. We see a conservator's hands, painstakingly joining two small shards of baked clay. The text is a legal code, but the line that defines the punishment for a specific crime is missing, lost in the break. This physical fragmentation is a constant reminder of the informational fragmentation we face. Was this damage purely the result of time, of the collapse of buildings and the carelessness of history? Or is the shattered state of the record itself part of the pattern? A reflection of a world that was not just abandoned, but broken, its operating manual torn into a million illegible pieces. Consider the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. In the 7th century BCE, he made a conscious, almost desperate effort to combat this historical amnesia. He sent scribes throughout Mesopotamia to collect and copy all the ancient texts they could find. The myths, the histories, the scientific treatises. He was building a backup of a dying world. But what he was collecting were already echoes, copies of texts that were already 1,000 years old. And then, his own capital, Nineveh, was destroyed. His magnificent library was burned, the clay tablets of his archive baked hard in the inferno and shattered into thousands of pieces. The attempt to save the memory resulted in its final, catastrophic fragmentation. The silence won. We look again at the great dividing line in the king list. Then the flood swept over. This is presented not as a myth, but as a historical event that separates two distinct epochs. Before the flood, the world of the impossibly long-lived rulers, the direct governors. After the flood, the world of men. The kingship is reinstalled from heaven. The system is rebooted, but it is an altered reality. The reigns of the new kings, though still long, are a fraction of what they were. The entire scale of time and power has been recalibrated downward. The flood was not just a deluge of water, it was an informational cataclysm, a great clearing of the slate that severed the new world from the memory and the operational reality of the old one. The very language of the governors eventually died. Sumerian, the tongue in which the foundational records were written, ceased to be a spoken language by the early 2nd millennium BCE. It became a fossil, a dead liturgical and scholarly language, preserved by Akkadian and Babylonian scribes, much as Latin was by medieval monks. The concepts, the administrative terms, the specific nuances of the original system were preserved, but the living connection was lost. Communication with the foundational era now required a specialist, a translator of dead ideas. The severance was complete. The world no longer spoke the language of its own architects. As the direct presence of the governors faded, the nature of human interaction with them fundamentally changed. The administrative report was replaced by the desperate prayer. The technology of governance was replaced by the technology of ritual. We see this in the texts. Early documents are lists, ledgers, and legal codes. Later documents are incantations, omen texts, and elaborate hymns designed to attract the attention of a distant and unresponsive power. Humanity was no longer a workforce reporting to a manager. It was a congregation crying out into a silent heaven. The entire purpose of the temple complex shifted from being an administrative center to being an antenna, a massive instrument designed to broadcast a signal to receivers that might no longer be listening. The ziggurats themselves, those artificial mountains of brick rising from the flat plains, stand as monuments to this absence. They were called Duranki, the bond of heaven and earth. They were connection points, stairways designed to bridge the gap between the terrestrial and the celestial. But their summits are empty platforms. They are stages for an appearance that no longer occurs, meeting rooms for a council that no longer convenes. The immense labor invested in their construction was an act of architectural hope, an attempt to rebuild a connection that had been broken. The profound silence at the top of a ziggurat, with only the wind for company, is perhaps the most powerful statement in this entire history. It is the sound of a dial tone that never ends. There is a deep melancholy that pervades the later Mesopotamian worldview, a sense of living in a diminished and shadowed copy of a former, more glorious reality. Theirs was not a myth of progress, but a memory of decline. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a broken and abandoned kingdom, struggling to operate the machinery of civilization with a user's manual that was mostly missing. This is the emotional weight of the silence. It is the feeling of being a caretaker of a garden whose original gardeners have long since departed, leaving behind only a few cryptic notes on how to tend the strange, cosmic plants they left behind. The most frustrating aspect of these gaps is that they conceal the why. The records are strangely silent on motivation. The scribe notes that the Anunnaki Council decided to create humanity to solve a labor problem, but not why the labor was necessary in the first place. The King List notes that the flood was sent to destroy mankind, but the deeper reasons for Enlil's dissatisfaction are treated with a kind of administrative brevity. The texts record the operational decisions with clarity, but the strategic purpose, the ultimate goal of the entire terrestrial project, is the single most important piece of information that has been erased from the record. This ancient amnesia resonates with our own condition. We too are a species adrift in a cosmos whose purpose we do not understand, living on a planet whose own deep history is largely inaccessible to us. We piece together fragments of geology, of genetics, of archaeology, trying to reconstruct a coherent story. We are also the children of a great forgetting. The silence that the Sumerian scribe confronted is, in a way, the same silence we confront when we look up at the night sky. The work of the archivist, the archaeologist, and the historian is a quiet, perhaps futile rebellion against this universal condition, this cosmic silence. The act concludes not with a discovery, but with the full realization of what has been lost. We are left looking at a single beautiful cylinder seal, a masterpiece of miniature carving. It depicts a human figure being led by a lesser deity into the presence of a great, seated god-king. The scene is clear, the details precise, but a fracture runs right through the face of the seated figure. His features are gone, obliterated by a single ancient break. All that remains is the outline of his authority, the shape of his throne, the gesture of the human approaching him. The central character of the entire story has been rendered faceless. The record shows us the meeting took place, but the identity of who we were meeting has been permanently erased. The archivist's desk is no longer a surface for examining individual curiosities. It has become a cartographer's table, upon which the fragments of a lost world are being reassembled. Here lies the prism of the king list, its impossible numbers a silent challenge to our chronology. Beside it, a tablet detailing the Atrahasis, the report of a labor dispute and its engineered solution. Nearby, a ration list from its meticulous accounting revealing a system of immense control, and a cylinder seal impression showing the quiet, orderly transfer of authority. These are no longer separate artifacts. Under the low, steady light, they begin to lock together, their edges aligning with an unnerving precision. They are the scattered pages of a single, coherent, and profoundly logical operational manual for a world that is no longer our own. What emerges from this assembly is not a collection of myths, but the blueprint of a system. A system with a clear corporate structure, from a remote chairman, Anu, to a terrestrial governor, Enlil, and a chief of technology, Enki. A system with designated industrial centers, a legally defined workforce, and a transferable package of core technologies known as the Me. The internal consistency of these records is perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all. The creation of humanity is not a divine mystery, but a pragmatic solution to a staffing problem. The establishment of civilization is not a slow evolution, but the deployment of a standardized kit. The logic is cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of the sentiment we project onto our gods. It is the logic of an administration, not a faith. Let us pause and feel the weight of that coherence. The sheer statistical improbability of multiple, distinct ancient cultures, from the scribes of Sumer to the priests of Egypt and the timekeepers of the Maya, independently inventing origin stories that are not stories at all, but functional administrative histories. These are not tales of wonder, but reports of succession, of labor, of the orderly handover of a pre-existing global enterprise. The consistency of the narrative structure, the shared memory of a non-human management team, and the functional purpose assigned to humanity begin to feel less like coincidence and more like the faint, persistent echo of a single, global historical fact. The silence of the archive is not empty. It is filled with the hum of this single, insistent, and deeply unsettling idea. This ancient, administrative worldview stands in stark, irreconcilable opposition to our own foundational narrative. Our story is one of emergence, of a slow, arduous climb from the mud of primitive existence, a triumph of human ingenuity against the forces of chaos. Their story is one of inheritance, of receiving a fully operational, pre-packaged world, a system of order delivered from on high. The two timelines cannot coexist. One must be a distortion of the other. Either their meticulous bureaucratic records are a strange and elaborate metaphor for a process they could not otherwise describe, or our cherished story of a self-made civilization is a fiction we constructed to fill the silence that followed the departure of our world's true architects. Here, the role of the great forgetting, the invisible antagonist of this history, becomes paramount. The gaps in the record, the sterile layers in the soil, the shattered tablets, they cease to be accidents of time. They become the evidence. A system so meticulously documented does not simply vanish without a reason. The silence feels deliberate, the fragmentation methodical. It suggests that the end of this ancient order was not a slow decline, but a controlled demolition, a shutdown, a severance. The erasure of the past was not a passive process of decay. It was an active event, a final administrative act whose purpose was to ensure that the inheritors of the system would never fully understand its origins or its ultimate purpose. The moment of transition, the great demarcation point of the flood, now reads not as a divine punishment, but as a planned obsolescence. It is the rebooting of a planetary system. The old order of long-lived Anunnaki governors is wiped from the board. The kingship is reinstalled, but it is a new version, a downgraded model for a new class of user. This is the moment we call the beginning of history, but the record frames it as a handover, a change in management from a non-human to a human administration. The new human kings are not pioneers. They are the first local managers, tasked with running a franchise whose corporate headquarters has just gone permanently offline, leaving them with only a fragmented, partial set of instructions and a profound sense of abandonment. This was not merely a political transition. It was a fundamental alteration in the physics of reality itself. Before the flood, the records describe a world operating under a different set of rules, a different scale of time. The reigns of 800 years are not just numbers. They are the data point of a different state of being. After the reboot, that world is gone. The lifespans of the new rulers shrink to a human scale. The direct physical interaction with the governors ceases. The very nature of possibility seems to have been recalibrated. We did not just inherit a kingdom. We inherited a changed world, a planet whose core operating system had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered, leaving us to navigate a new and diminished reality whose limitations we accept as natural law. Imagine finding yourself the sole occupant of a vast, ancient, and silent factory. In every hall, there is complex machinery you cannot comprehend, its purpose a complete mystery. The power is off, the control rooms are locked, the schematics are missing. You and your descendants learn to live in this place. You use the giant gears as tables, the conduits as shelters. You invent stories about the great builders who must have constructed it. You develop rituals, praying that one day the silent machines will hum to life again. This is the condition of humanity. We are living in the quiet, repurposed ruins of a vast project, mistaking the abandoned factory floor for the entire universe. To follow this line of inquiry any further is to step away from the comfortable shores of received history. It is to accept that the deepest questions may not lead to comforting answers, but to larger, more unsettling rooms, and to archives that are deeper and darker still. This is not a search for a final revelation, but a commitment to the vigil itself, to sitting with the evidence, however strange, and honoring the integrity of the questions that arise from it. Those who choose to continue this watch are not seeking a simple truth, but a more honest relationship with the scale of our own ignorance. If this framework is held, for a moment, as a possibility, then our entire understanding of the past is inverted. What we call human history, the 6,000-year saga of empires, wars, art, and philosophy, is not the main story. It is the epilogue. It is the sprawling, chaotic, and often tragic account of what a newly orphaned species did after it was left alone in the house. Our greatest triumphs and our most profound failures are all part of this secondary narrative, this long period of improvisation that began when the original script was suddenly and inexplicably withdrawn. We are not the authors of the story. We are the characters in the final act, trying to make sense of a plot whose beginning is forever lost to us. The global echoes of the Sumerian account now appear in a different light. The Egyptian memory of Zep-Tepi, the first time ruled by gods, and the Mayan story of a humanity designed to be keepers of the days, are no longer independent myths. They are the fragmented, corrupted data recovered from the same system crash. They are different cultures attempting to reconstruct the same lost memory of a single, coherent, planetary civilization. The recurring patterns of divine succession, of humanity's functional creation, and of a transferred package of knowledge are the ghostly signatures of this forgotten global order, like the faint burn-in of an image on a screen that has long been turned off. This reframes our entire civilizational project as a kind of planetary-scale cargo cult. We are the descendants of those who witnessed the departure. We build our ziggurats and pyramids, pointing them to the stars, not as acts of pure faith, but as dim, ritualistic memories of a time when they were functional connection points. Our religions, our statecraft, our sciences, are they all, at their core, just increasingly sophisticated attempts to reverse engineer the lost technology of the gods? Are we spending our entire history trying to rebuild the radio, performing the ceremonies we half remember from the old instruction manual, hoping to re-establish contact with a control tower that may no longer be listening? The most profound silence in all these records concerns the ultimate purpose. The scribe tells us how humanity was created, but not why the Anunnaki needed a workforce on this planet in the first place. The texts describe the meticulous management of Earth's resources, but never state the goal of the enterprise. Was this planet a mine, its resources being extracted and shipped elsewhere? Was it a biological laboratory, a genetic experiment, or was it simply a remote colonial outpost? The cold, administrative language of the tablets suggests a purpose that was entirely unsentimental, a strategic objective in which humanity was not the subject, but an incidental tool. Our entire existence may have been a minor line item in a cosmic business plan we will never be allowed to see. We stand now at a conceptual precipice, looking back across the entire landscape of human history. The grand sweep of our recorded past, the glory of Rome, the wisdom of Athens, the art of the Renaissance, the terror of the world wars. It all seems to shift in scale. It becomes the story of a family of castaways on a deserted island, creating their own complex society, their own triumphs and tragedies, all while being completely unaware that the island itself is a single abandoned piece of a much larger intercontinental shipping network. The immense drama of our history has been playing out in a single quiet corner of a much larger, silent, and forgotten stage. The question is no longer simply about who the Anunnaki were or what happened in ancient Sumer. The implication of the record changes everything. It forces a re-evaluation of our own identity. The ultimate mystery is not what happened before history, but what it means to be a species whose history began with an act of forgetting. Are we the self-made masters of our world, having risen from the dust by our own will and intellect? Or are we something else entirely? A species engineered for a purpose, the caretakers of an inherited technology we barely understand, living out our destiny in the long, quiet shadow of our absent creators. The final image is not one of a dusty tablet in an archive, but of the Earth itself, seen from a great distance. A silent, turning sphere of blue and white, suspended in the blackness. The image is familiar, beautiful, and reassuring. But the perspective has changed. We are no longer looking at the cradle of humanity, a home of our own making. We are looking at the evidence. We are looking at a monument. We are looking at a vast, beautiful, and profoundly complex piece of machinery, a silent and abandoned artifact whose original function is now the greatest, and perhaps the last, true mystery of our world. The light in the archive is finally extinguished. The inquiry for a time is over. We are left where we began, in the deep, weighted silence of a room outside of time. The air is cool and still, carrying only the faint, dry scent of ancient earth and preserved memory. Before us, unseen now in the perfect darkness, rests the clay prism. It is a single, small, stubborn fact, a piece of a world that refuses to be entirely forgotten. The journey through its records, across continents and millennia, has not brought us to a destination. It has returned us to this starting point, to this silent object, but the room we have returned to is now infinitely larger, its shadows filled with the weight of a history we were never meant to read. The vigil is not over. It has only just been passed to us. The object itself continues its work in the dark. Its sharp, precise cuneiform markings hold their story with an indifference to our presence or our understanding. Each wedge is a testament to the scribe's hand, to a mind that saw no contradiction in its own records, that simply documented the transfer of a world from one administration to another. The clay, baked hard by a long-dead Mesopotamian sun, has outlasted the empires that rose and fell above it, outlasted the languages that tried to explain it, and now outlasts the brief flicker of our investigation. It does not offer answers. It does not seek to convince. It simply is. It is a piece of the original ledger, a surviving page from a planetary operating manual whose authors have long since vanished from the building. We began this inquiry with a simple question, born from a single line of text. But the journey has not answered it. It has dismantled it. The question is no longer whether the records are true, but what it means to live in a world whose foundational truths have been so thoroughly and systematically erased. We are no longer simply reading a history. We are confronting the architecture of a forgetting, a great silence that stands as the true, invisible monument at the heart of our civilization. The prism on the table is not a key to unlock the past. It is a mirror, reflecting the profound and unsettling scale of our own inherited amnesia. We came seeking their story, and in the end, we have only found the empty space that defines the beginning of our own. The darkness in the vault is no longer an absence of light. It has become a presence in itself. It is the physical embodiment of the gaps in the record, of the sterile layers in the soil, of the shattered tablets that cannot be reassembled. It is the quiet, patient antagonist against whom the scribe and the archaeologist have waged their long, losing battle. To sit in this darkness is to feel the true gravity of what has been lost. It is to understand that our history is not a continuous line stretching back to a known origin, but a small, illuminated island, a brief campfire lit in the midst of an ancient and incomprehensible night, surrounded on all sides by a silence that was here long before us and will remain long after we are gone. The narrator's voice, which has guided us through these archives, now begins to recede. It leaves the stage, for its role was only to point, to connect, to hold the lamp steady for a moment. The voice was never the source of the story. The source has always been the clay, the stone, the dust. Now, as the human presence withdraws, the artifacts reclaim their sovereign silence. They do not need our interpretation. Their existence is the statement. They are the permanent residents of this quiet, and we were only temporary guests, permitted for a short time to listen at the door of a room whose conversations ended thousands of years ago. The responsibility now is not to speak further, but to learn to listen to the quality of this profound and enduring quiet. What remains when the analysis ceases is the pattern itself. The echo, the structural resonance between the records of Sumer, the memories of Egypt, and the calendars of the Maya. This pattern is a ghost in the machine of history, a faint signal that persists through the noise of millennia. It is the memory of a single, coherent, global system. It is the blueprint of a world built on a logic not our own. This pattern does not need our belief. It is a form, a shape in the data, as real and as measurable as the alignment of a pyramid to a star. It is the last faint heat signature of a vast, complex engine that was shut down long before our own story was first written. The work of the scribe, seen from this final vantage point, appears in a new light. It was not merely an act of record-keeping. It was an act of preservation against an encroaching void. Perhaps they too felt the great silence descending. Perhaps they saw the memory of the architects fading from the world and understood that their task was not simply to manage the present, but to anchor the past before it slipped away entirely. Their meticulous, repetitive, dispassionate work was a form of ritual, an attempt to keep the connection to the source code alive, to maintain the integrity of the original program in a world that was rapidly forgetting the language in which it was written. They were the first archivists of the absence. We are left with the image of the archive itself, a vast and silent library of the forgotten. The single prism on the table is but one artifact among millions. Imagine the camera pulling back, revealing not one table, but endless rows of them. Not one vault, but a labyrinth of vaults stretching into the darkness. Each shelf holds 1,000 silent tablets, each tablet a fragment of the same immense, broken story. It is a city of ghosts, a metropolis of unanswered questions. The scale of what we do not know, of what has been lost, is the only true and certain knowledge that this journey can provide. Our history is a single, legible book, in a library of millions whose pages have turned to dust. The silence that fills this space is not one of peace. It is the silence of suspended function. It is the quiet of a control room where the monitors are dark and the consoles are cold to the touch. It is the stillness of a harbor where the great ships that once connected continents lie scuttled and submerged. The artifacts are the last remaining pieces of this abandoned infrastructure. They are the silent, unpowered instruments on the bridge of a derelict starship, their dials frozen on the last readings taken before the crew disappeared. To be in their presence is to feel the profound, lingering hum of a purpose that has been withdrawn. This feeling does not resolve. It is not meant to. The inquiry was never designed to lead to a conclusion, but to a condition. The condition of awareness. It is the state of mind of the archaeologist who, after a lifetime of digging, realizes that the most important discovery is the sheer depth of the earth yet to be excavated. It is the state of mind of the astronomer who understands that every new star catalogued only increases the immensity of the surrounding darkness. The purpose was not to find the answer, but to comprehend the true cosmic scale of the question itself, and to learn to stand before it without demanding that it shrink to a size we can comfortably contain. The story, in the end, is not about them. It is not about the Anunnaki, or the pre-Diluvian kings, or the architects of a forgotten world. It is about us. It is about the nature of our own consciousness, born into a world whose foundational memories had already been erased. It is about a species that defines itself by its own creations, its own history, its own progress, without ever suspecting that it might be living in the shadow of a far greater and now absent creation. The mystery is not in the sky or buried under the desert. It is in us. It is the silence that lies at the very foundation of our own story. The final question is not what happened then, but what is happening now. We continue to build our civilizations, to write our histories, to reach for the stars, driven by an unnamed and ancient sense of incompletion. We are still performing the rituals, still building the towers, still broadcasting our signals into the vast, unresponsive quiet. The search for our origins, the deep and persistent pull of the past, may not be a simple academic curiosity. It may be the oldest and most fundamental human instinct, the dim, cellular memory of a connection that was severed, and the unending, unconscious attempt to restore it. The camera has now pulled back so far that the archive itself is lost to view. We are left with only the darkness. The story has returned to the silence from which it emerged. Nothing has been solved. No final truth has been revealed. A door has been opened, not onto a room full of answers, but onto a corridor that stretches into an unlit and perhaps infinite distance. The past has not been explained. It has been remembered, and in that act of remembering, its power is not diminished, but restored. The silence is not an end. It is the space in which the real inquiry must now begin, long after the screen has faded to black. The prism remains. The dust remains. The silence remains. And we, the inheritors of the question, are left to keep watch in the space between.